William Blackwood's polished leather boots had never touched the dirt near the cattle pens until that Tuesday morning in May. He typically sent managers to handle business in the rougher parts of town, but rumors had reached him that some of his own ranch hands were skipping meals at his operation to eat elsewhere. This wasn't just about the cost of wasted food. It was about maintaining control and standards. If his workers were choosing primitive alternatives over what he provided, it suggested a breakdown in the order he'd carefully established. The cattle pens occupied the eastern edge of Dodge City, where the smells of livestock and the sounds of rough men dominated the landscape. William walked through with his manager, noting with approval the efficiency of operations, the quality of the cattle being prepared for shipment. Then he saw it. A ramshackle food stall made of weathered wood and patched canvas, smoke rising from a small cooking fire, a line of workers waiting with the patient hunger of men who did physical labor for modest wages. The woman running the stall was Apache. He could tell immediately from her appearance and the style of her simple clothing. She moved with quick efficiency, serving food onto tin plates, accepting coins, maintaining a rhythm that suggested long practice. Her face was young but weathered, showing the kind of hardship that came from surviving on society's margins. William felt immediate disgust, not at her personally. He barely thought of her as a person, but at what she represented. Dodge City was trying to establish itself as a respectable community, attracting investment and better class of settlers. This kind of primitive operation belonged in the past. They were all trying to leave behind. He asked his manager about the stall, keeping his voice neutral, though his contempt was clear. The manager explained apologetically that the woman had been there for about 8 months, serving cheap meals to laborers. Some of the food was strange. Apache dishes that most white folks wouldn't recognize, but also familiar items like beans and cornbread. The men who ate there claimed her cooking was better than what they could get elsewhere for the price. Better than what William provided at his ranch, the manager admitted reluctantly. William approached the stall, and the woman looked up from her cooking. Her eyes met his directly, without the deference he'd come to expect from people of lower stations. This annoyed him further. He asked what she was serving, his tone making clear he found the entire operation questionable. She answered in clear English with only slight accent, listing items that included both recognizable foods and things he'd never heard of. When he asked about ingredients, she explained she used wild plants from the prairie combined with traditional preparations. Wild plants. William seized on this immediately. Did the town council know she was gathering random vegetation and serving it to workers? Had anyone verified the safety of her cooking methods? Was she even authorized to operate a food establishment in Dodge City? The woman, he learned her name was Narlin only later, responded calmly that she'd been operating for months without any complaints, that the men who ate her food came back repeatedly, and that she knew more about the plants of this region than most people who'd lived here all their lives. Her calm confidence in the face of his obvious status and disapproval infuriated William more than fear would have. He told her directly that her operation was an embarrassment to Dodge City, that she should consider relocating to somewhere more appropriate for her kind of business. Narlin's response was simple. She had as much right to operate here as anyone else, and she'd stay as long as her customers wanted her food. William walked away from that encounter determined to end what he saw as a problem. William Blackwood began his campaign against Narlin's food stall the very next day. He started with the town council, where his influence and financial contributions gave him considerable sway. At the next meeting, he raised concerns about unregulated food vendors operating near the cattle pens, suggesting that Dodge City needed proper standards for establishments serving the public. His concerns were framed around public health and the town's reputation. He didn't mention Narlin specifically at first, allowing the council members to arrive at the connection themselves. He spoke about the importance of ensuring that Dodge City projected an image of civilization and order to potential investors and settlers. Food vendors operating without proper oversight, he argued, suggested a town that couldn't maintain basic standards. The council responded exactly as William had anticipated. They established a committee to develop regulations for food establishments, with William himself appointed to help draft the standards. He made sure the requirements would be burdensome enough to drive out small operators: fees for licensing, mandatory inspections, requirements for permanent structures rather than temporary stalls. While the regulations were being developed, William pursued other strategies. He visited the owners of established restaurants in Dodge City, suggesting that unlicensed competition from primitive vendors was undercutting their legitimate businesses. He implied that their silence on the matter was allowing their own profits to be stolen. Some restaurant owners needed little encouragement. They'd resented Nalin's stall from the beginning, seeing it as unfair competition. Others were more hesitant, recognizing that Nalin served a different clientele than their establishments catered to. But William's influence and the economic pressure he could apply made neutrality uncomfortable. He also spread rumors with careful indirection. At the Kansas Cattlemen's Association meetings, he mentioned hearing concerns about unusual foods being served to workers, hinting at potential health risks without making specific accusations. He knew how rumors worked in frontier communities. A suggestion from a respected source could spread and amplify into accepted truth. The workers who ate at Nalin's stall noticed the change in atmosphere. Some were questioned by employers about whether the food they ate was safe. Others faced mockery from those who'd adopted William's contempt for Apache cooking. The pressure was subtle but real, designed to make choosing Nalin's food socially and potentially professionally costly. William also approached Nalin directly a second time, offering to buy her stall and equipment for a sum that would allow her to relocate to another town. His manner made clear this was generosity rather than fair negotiation. He was offering her an escape from inevitable defeat. Nalin refused, her tone polite but absolutely firm. She said she'd built her business through hard work and intended to continue operating. William's offer wasn't sufficient to start over elsewhere, and besides, she saw no reason to leave when she'd done nothing wrong. William's response revealed his true contempt. He told her she needed to understand her place, that someone like her couldn't expect to operate successfully in a town that was becoming civilized and prosperous. She should take what he offered and be grateful, because the alternative would be losing everything when the town council shut her down officially. Nalin's calm in the face of his threats unnerved William more than anger would have. She simply said she'd wait to see what happened, that she had faith in her ability to adapt to circumstances as they developed. After William left, Nalin did something that would prove crucial. She began documenting everything about her business in careful detail. The new regulations passed the town council with little debate. William had drafted them carefully. They appeared reasonable on the surface, focused on legitimate concerns about public health and safety. But their practical effect was to make small-scale food operations nearly impossible. License fees were set at amounts that only established restaurants could easily afford. Building requirements mandated permanent structures with specific features that would cost more than most small operators earned in a year. Inspection protocols were rigid and frequent, designed for larger commercial kitchens rather than simple food stalls. Nalin received official notice that she had 60 days to comply with all new regulations or cease operations. The fees alone would consume most of her modest savings. Meeting the building requirements would be impossible without substantial loans that no bank would extend to an Apache woman with no collateral beyond her small operation. William heard about the notice with satisfaction, assuming the problem would soon resolve itself. He'd already identified the location where Nalin's stall stood as valuable. close to the cattle pens, but with potential for development once it was cleared of its current use. He had plans for a proper warehouse that would serve his shipping operations, but Nalin didn't simply accept defeat. She began by examining the regulations with care, looking for any flexibility or alternative paths to compliance. She discovered that food vendors who primarily served preserved goods rather than freshly prepared meals faced different standards, less stringent requirements based on the assumption that preserved foods posed fewer immediate health risks. This distinction gave her an idea that would transform everything. Nalin had always made small batches of preserved foods for her own use. Traditional Apache preparations of dried meat, preserved vegetables, herb mixtures that extended food's usability and enhanced its nutritional value. These were techniques her grandmother had taught her, adapted through generations for survival in harsh conditions where preserving the harvest meant the difference between life and death. She'd occasionally sold these preserved items at her stall, but had focused mainly on fresh-cooked meals. Now, she began to see these preservation skills not as supplementary to her business, but as its potential future. She experimented with adapting her traditional preparations for the needs of the cattle drives and frontier travelers who were her primary customers. The challenge was creating preserved foods that would last through long journeys, taste better than the standard salt pork and hardtack that most drovers endured, provide genuine nutrition, and cost less than existing commercial options. Nalin spent her evenings after the stall closed testing recipes, combining Apache preservation techniques with ingredients readily available in Kansas. She used wild plants from the prairie that others considered weeds, plants she knew had medicinal properties, nutritional value, or flavor enhancement qualities. She experimented with drying methods, seasoning combinations, packaging approaches. Her small room behind the boarding house became a laboratory where traditional wisdom met practical innovation. After 2 weeks of intensive experimentation, Nalin had developed several products she believed could work. A seasoned, dried meat that reconstituted with hot water into a nutritious stew, a mixture of dried vegetables and herbs that created flavorful meals with minimal preparation, a type of preserved pemmican adapted for frontier tastes, and several medicinal teas made from prairie plants that could address common trail ailments. She began offering these preserved items at her stall alongside her regular fresh cooking. The initial response from customers was curious but hesitant. Preserved food had a terrible reputation among frontier travelers. It usually meant barely edible rations that you choked down only when no alternative existed. But Nalin's regular customers trusted her cooking enough to try her preserved versions. The feedback surprised everyone, including Nalin herself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Samuel Chen owned the Great Plains Cattle Company, one of the larger outfits moving Texas longhorns to railroad markets through Kansas. He'd been facing a persistent problem, feeding his drovers on the long drives. Standard trail rations were so unpleasant that men would quit rather than endure them for extended periods. This meant higher wages to compensate for the misery, difficulty retaining experienced drovers, and reduced efficiency when men were poorly nourished. Samuel had heard about Nalin's food stall from some of his drovers who raved about her cooking when they were in Dodge City. Curious, he stopped by one afternoon when his outfit was passing through. What caught his attention wasn't the fresh meals she served, but the preserved food she'd begun selling. He purchased samples of everything she offered, planning to test them on the trail. 3 weeks later, Samuel returned to Dodge City specifically to find Nalin. The preserved foods she'd sold him had performed beyond anything he'd experienced. They lasted the entire journey without spoiling. They actually tasted good. His drovers had commented repeatedly about the improvement over standard rations. The preparation was simple enough for trail conditions. And most importantly, his men felt better, had more energy, complained less about the food situation. Samuel wanted to place a large order, enough preserved food to supply his entire operation for the summer driving season. He was talking about quantities far beyond anything Nalin had imagined, orders that would require her to scale up production dramatically. But the price he was offering made the investment worthwhile. Nalin faced a decision point. Accepting Samuel's order meant transforming her operation from a small food stall into something closer to a manufacturing business. She'd need space to work, equipment for larger-scale production, more ingredients than she could gather personally, some way to manage the logistics of creating and delivering such large quantities. She'd also need to navigate the town's new regulations, though focusing on preserved foods rather than fresh cooking gave her more flexibility. Most challenging of all, she'd be risking everything on a business model she'd never attempted before. If she failed to deliver what Samuel needed, or if the quality didn't hold up at scale, she'd lose not just his business, but her reputation with the drovers who were her core customers. But Nalin had learned through hardship that playing safe meant slow decline. The new regulations were going to shut down her food stall eventually, regardless. This order from Samuel represented not just survival, but potential for real success, for building something that couldn't be easily dismissed or regulated away. She told Samuel she could meet his needs if he gave her 2 weeks to prepare and was willing to pay half up front to cover her initial costs. Samuel agreed immediately, recognizing a good business opportunity when he saw one. The handshake deal they made in front of her modest food stall would end up being worth more than either of them imagined. Nalin spent those 2 weeks in a frenzy of activity. She negotiated with a warehouse owner for space to work, leveraging Samuel's advance payment and the promise of steady business. She hired 3 Apache women from the local community who needed work, teaching them her preparation techniques. She arranged with hunters and gatherers to supply ingredients in larger quantities. She designed better packaging using available materials. She worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, driven by the recognition that this was her one chance. When Samuel returned 2 weeks later, Nalin had his order ready, carefully packed, clearly labeled, organized for easy transport. Samuel inspected everything with the thoroughness of a man whose business depended on reliable supplies. Then he placed an order for twice the amount, to be delivered in 6 weeks. Word spread quickly among the cattle outfits. Other companies approached Nalin, curious about these preserved foods that the Great Plains drovers were raving about. Within 3 months, Nalin's business had transformed completely. Her food stall at the cattle pens had closed, but not because of William Blackwood's regulations. She'd moved into a proper warehouse space where she employed 8 workers producing preserved foods that were shipped to cattle outfits throughout Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska. The profits from her business allowed her to not only meet the town's regulations, but exceed them. Her facility was cleaner and better organized than many established operations in Dodge City. She'd even hired a lawyer to ensure all her paperwork and licenses were impeccably correct. The success wasn't just financial. The drovers who used her products spread the word about their quality and effectiveness. Cattle company owners discovered that investing in better trail food resulted in happier, healthier, more productive workers who stayed with the outfit longer. Nalin's preserved foods became known by name. The Apache woman's provisions developed a reputation for quality that commanded premium prices. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. William Blackwood's attempt to drive Nalin out of business had instead forced her to innovate in ways that made her far more successful than her original food stall could ever have been. If he'd simply ignored her, she'd likely still be serving meals to day laborers from her modest stand. His hostility had pushed her toward the breakthrough that transformed her circumstances. The business success also elevated Nalin's position in Dodge City in ways that wealth alone couldn't explain. She employed local workers, Apache and white alike, providing good wages and fair treatment. She purchased supplies from local vendors, becoming a valued customer for hunters, farmers, and merchants. She paid taxes that contributed to the town's revenue. She represented a success story that frontier towns loved to claim. Someone who'd built something from nothing through hard work and innovation. William Blackwood learned about Nalin's success gradually, each piece of information more galling than the last. He first heard that she'd landed a major contract with a cattle outfit. Then he learned she'd expanded her operations. Then he discovered that established businesses in Dodge City were treating her as a legitimate peer, that the bank had extended her credit, that the same town council members he'd convinced to pass restrictive regulations were now praising her as an example of frontier entrepreneurship. What bothered William most wasn't just that Nalin had succeeded despite his efforts. It was that her success made him look foolish. People remembered his campaign against her food stall, his warnings about primitive operations and questionable foods. Now, those same people saw him as someone who'd failed to recognize valuable innovation, who'd let prejudice blind him to opportunity. Some even suggested that if William had invested in Nalin's operation instead of trying to destroy it, he could have profited from her success. His reputation as a shrewd businessman began to acquire cracks. If he'd been so wrong about Nalin, what else might his judgment be flawed about? His absolute confidence in his own assessments suddenly looked more like arrogance. Younger businessmen in Dodge City started questioning his advice, pointing to the Nalin situation as evidence that William's thinking might be outdated. The challenge to his authority was subtle, but real. William's initial response was to dismiss Nalin's success as temporary, a fad that would fade when novelty wore off. He told anyone who'd listen that preserved foods were a limited market, that her operation would collapse when competition emerged, that she'd gotten lucky but lacked the business acumen for sustained success. But months passed, and Nalin's business continued to grow. She expanded her product line, developed new preservation techniques, established distribution networks. She proved to be a capable business operator who understood logistics, quality control, and customer relations. Her success wasn't luck. It was the result of skill, innovation, and hard work. William found himself in an uncomfortable position. Doubling down on his contempt for Nalin made him look increasingly petty and disconnected from reality. The confrontation came at the Kansas Cattlemen's Association annual meeting, held in Dodge City's finest hotel. William attended as he always did, expecting to be consulted on important decisions and treated with the deference his wealth and experience commanded. But this year felt different from the moment he entered. Samuel Chen had brought Nalin as his guest, introducing her to other cattle outfit owners as the supplier who'd revolutionized his trail food operations. She was dressed simply but appropriately. Her presence at the meeting unusual but not unprecedented. Successful suppliers were occasionally invited to discuss their services. William's first instinct was to object to her presence, but the meeting rules didn't give him grounds. She'd been invited by a member in good standing and was there to discuss business relevant to the association's interests. He could only watch with growing irritation as she was introduced to men he'd known for years, as they asked questions about her products and preservation techniques with genuine interest. When the formal presentations began, Samuel gave a talk about innovations in trail logistics. He spent significant time discussing how improved food supplies had reduced drover turnover, increased efficiency, and lowered overall costs despite higher per-unit food expenses. He credited Nalin specifically, detailing how her products had outperformed traditional trail rations in every measurable way. Then Nalin herself was invited to speak. She discussed traditional Apache food preservation methods, explaining the principles behind techniques that had sustained her people through harsh conditions for generations. She described how she'd adapted these methods for cattle drive applications, combining traditional knowledge with understanding of frontier needs. Her presentation was clear, knowledgeable, and practical. She spoke like someone who understood both the cultural foundations of her techniques and the business requirements of her customers. The association members responded with enthusiasm, asking detailed questions about availability, scalability, and whether she could develop specialized products for specific needs. Several outfit owners approached her after the presentation to discuss potential orders. William watched all this with mounting fury. This Apache woman, who he'd tried to drive out of Dodge City, was now being celebrated by his peers, treated as an expert and innovator while he sat marginalized. The reversal was complete and public. After the formal meeting concluded, William approached Nalin directly. Several association members were still gathered around her discussing business, but William's interruption scattered them. His anger was visible enough to make people uncomfortable. He told Nalin that her success didn't change what she was or where she came from, that she might have fooled some people with her primitive cooking tricks, but he recognized her operation for what it was, temporary exploitation of novelty that would collapse when people came to their senses, that she should enjoy her moment because it wouldn't last. Nalin's response was quiet, but devastating. She said she'd noticed that William seemed more bothered by her success than pleased about innovations that were benefiting the cattle industry he claimed to care about. She wondered whether his opposition to her had ever really been about business concerns or town standards, or whether it had always been about his discomfort with someone like her succeeding in spaces he thought belonged only to people like him. She said she hoped someday William would examine why her presence and success threatened him so deeply, because that self-examination might help him understand things about himself that were currently preventing him from being the person he could be. Then she politely excused herself to continue conversations with potential customers. William stood alone, his anger mixing with humiliation, watching Nalin conduct business with men who would once have deferred to his judgment without question. The weeks following the Cattlemen's Association meeting were difficult for William Blackwood. His attempt to humiliate Nalin had instead exposed his own prejudices in ways he couldn't walk back. The story of his angry confrontation with her spread through Dodge City's business community, and the interpretation wasn't flattering. People who'd once viewed William as a successful, if somewhat arrogant businessman, now saw him as someone whose judgment was compromised by irrational prejudice. Several business relationships that William had considered solid began to cool. A banker who'd always approved his loans suddenly required additional documentation and expressed concerns about William's decision-making. A business partner in a land speculation venture quietly suggested they might want to reconsider their arrangement. The railroad company that stored equipment on William's property started exploring alternative locations. None of these setbacks were catastrophic individually, but together they represented a shift in how the business community viewed him. William's initial response was to blame others for failing to support him, to dismiss the criticism as weakness and misplaced sympathy. He told himself that people would eventually recognize their mistake in elevating someone like Nalin. That time would prove his assessment correct. But privately, in moments he couldn't quite suppress, William began to experience something unfamiliar: doubt. He found himself thinking about Nalin's words at the association meeting, her suggestion that his opposition had never really been about business or standards, but about his discomfort with her success. The idea troubled him, because he prided himself on being rational and practical, someone whose decisions were based on objective assessment rather than emotion or prejudice. Yet he couldn't deny that his campaign against Nalin had been irrational from a business perspective. If he'd approached her success objectively, he would have recognized the opportunity: investment in her operation, partnership in distribution, acquisition of her techniques for his own benefit. Instead, he'd worked actively to destroy something that was clearly valuable, and his only explanation was the one Nalin had offered: her presence and success in spaces he'd thought belonged only to people like him had felt like a threat to his understanding of how the world should work. This recognition didn't come easily or all at once. It emerged gradually through accumulated evidence that his prejudices had cost him not just business opportunities, but reputation and respect. William began to notice things he'd previously dismissed: the skill and innovation Nalin had demonstrated, the genuine value in the knowledge she'd brought from her Apache heritage, the business acumen she'd shown in building and scaling her operation. He started to understand, reluctantly, that his contempt for her had been based on assumptions about worth and capability that had no foundation in actual observation. The most difficult realization was that he'd spent years in Kansas believing himself to be a builder and innovator when he'd actually been doing something much simpler: exploiting resources and opportunities that others lacked the capital to access. He'd called this business skill, but it required no particular brilliance or innovation. Nalin, in contrast, had created genuine value from almost nothing, had identified a real problem and developed a novel solution, had built something that didn't exist before she imagined it. By his own stated standards of entrepreneurship and innovation, she was far more impressive than he'd ever been. William's pride made this recognition painful. He'd spent his adult life certain of his superiority to people he'd considered less civilized, less educated, less capable. Acknowledging that an Apache woman with no formal education or capital had out-innovated him challenged his entire self-conception. He could have simply continued in denial, doubling down on prejudices that were increasingly costly to maintain. William Blackwood spent 3 weeks wrestling with pride before he finally acted. He drafted and discarded a dozen letters to Nalin before settling on something that felt honest without requiring complete self-abasement. He requested a meeting at her warehouse, acknowledging that he came as a supplicant rather than someone with authority to make demands. Nalin's response was brief but agreeable. She set a time and made clear she expected the conversation to be respectful and productive. When William arrived at Nalin's warehouse, he was struck by how efficiently she'd organized the operation. The space was clean, well-ventilated, and logically arranged for production flow. Workers moved with practiced coordination, and the quality control systems were more rigorous than those at many established businesses in Dodge City. It was undeniably professional, a reminder that Nalin's success wasn't accidental or temporary. Nalin received William in a small office she'd created in one corner of the warehouse. She offered coffee with the hospitality that Apache culture valued, creating space for difficult conversation without requiring immediate confrontation. William accepted, grateful for the ritual that delayed the moment when he'd have to speak. When he finally began, William struggled to find words that were honest without being self-pitying. He acknowledged that he'd been wrong about Nalin and her operation, that his actions had been driven by prejudices he was only now beginning to recognize and examine. He said he understood if she couldn't or wouldn't forgive his behavior, but he wanted her to know that he recognized the harm he'd tried to cause and regretted it. Nalin listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When William finished, she asked him directly, what did he want from this conversation? An absolution that would make him feel better about himself? A business opportunity now that her success was established? Or was he genuinely trying to change his understanding of the world and his place in it? The directness of her question forced William to confront his own motivations. He admitted he didn't fully know. He'd come because continuing to treat her with contempt felt wrong now that he recognized her worth, but also because his prejudices had become costly to maintain. He couldn't claim his motivations were purely altruistic. Nalin appreciated the honesty. She said she'd experienced enough false apologies to recognize when someone was performing contrition versus actually grappling with difficult self-examination. William seemed to be doing the latter, which she respected even if the process was incomplete. She told him that forgiveness wasn't really the relevant question. She didn't need to forgive him to move forward with her life and business. The question was whether William could actually change his fundamental assumptions about worth and capability, or whether his acknowledgement of error about her specifically would remain an isolated exception while his broader prejudices continued unchanged. William had no good answer to that. He said he was trying to examine his assumptions, but the work was harder than he'd anticipated. Recognizing that he'd been wrong about Nalin was forcing him to question everything he'd been certain about progress, civilization, whose knowledge mattered, what success really meant. It was uncomfortable and disorienting, and he didn't know yet where the questioning would lead. Nalin said that discomfort was probably necessary for genuine change. She shared something about her own experience, how losing everything she'd known when her people were displaced had forced her to question assumptions she'd taken for granted. She'd had to learn that survival required adaptability, that preserving what mattered from her heritage meant finding new forms for old wisdom. The process had been painful but also transformative, allowing her to create something that honored her grandmother's teachings while serving her new circumstances. William found himself telling Nalin about his own background in ways he rarely discussed, how his father had made a fortune in railroads, but had always seemed unsatisfied, always chasing the next acquisition. How William had inherited both money and that restless need to prove worth through accumulation. What emerged from that first difficult conversation was unexpected. A tentative working relationship that would eventually become genuine partnership. William recognized that Nalin's operation had potential for even greater expansion, but was constrained by limited capital and distribution networks. Nalin acknowledged that William's connections and business infrastructure could accelerate her growth if she could trust his motivations. They negotiated carefully, with legal agreements that protected Nalin's interests and gave her controlling authority over production and quality. William would invest capital and provide distribution support through his existing business relationships. In exchange, he'd receive a share of profits, but no creative control over the products or techniques. It was a more limited role than William typically accepted in business ventures, but that limitation was necessary for Nalin's trust. The partnership proved remarkably effective. William's railroad connections allowed Nalin's preserved foods to reach markets in Kansas City, Denver, and even Chicago. His capital enabled her to upgrade equipment and expand production capacity. His business experience helped with contracts, negotiations, and dealing with territorial bureaucracy. In return, Nalin's innovation and quality standards gave William association with something genuinely valuable rather than just profitable. Her operation became the most successful venture he'd ever been involved with, and for the first time, his success felt connected to creating something rather than just extracting value from opportunities. The personal relationship between William and Nalin evolved more slowly than the business partnership. They worked together efficiently, but with continued wariness on Nalin's part. She'd seen too many instances of initial good intentions from white settlers fading when maintaining them became inconvenient. She waited to see whether William's change would prove sustainable or would revert to old patterns when tested. The test came when a newspaper in Kansas City published an article about Nalin's operation that was both admiring and condescending. The writer praised her preserved foods, while framing her success as remarkable specifically because she was Apache, as if innovation from someone of her background was surprising rather than expected. The article generated attention that was good for business but uncomfortable in its assumptions. Some of William's business associates who'd been impressed by the preserved foods became awkward when they learned his partner was Apache. A few suggested, not unkindly, that William should consider acquiring Nalin's techniques and marketing them under his name to avoid complications. The suggestion was framed as practical business advice about maximizing value and avoiding social complications. William's response revealed how much had changed. He told those associates bluntly that Nalin's knowledge and innovation were the source of the value, that attempting to separate her from her work would be both unethical and stupid. He made clear that anyone who wanted to benefit from the preserved foods would need to acknowledge their actual origin. The response cost him some relationships, but strengthened others with people who respected the position. More importantly, it demonstrated to Nalin that William's change wasn't just personal convenience, but a genuine shift in values. She began to trust that the partnership could be sustained. Over the following months, William and Nalin developed something approaching friendship. They discovered shared interests in business strategy and product innovation. They learned to argue productively about expansion plans and risk management. They found they could challenge each other's assumptions without destroying respect. William began to understand aspects of Apache culture through Nalin's explanations, recognizing the sophisticated knowledge systems embedded in practices he'd previously dismissed as primitive. Nalin saw William struggle genuinely with examining his privilege and prejudices, which gave her patience with his incomplete progress. One evening, after a particularly productive day reviewing expansion plans, Nalin asked William what he'd learned from their partnership. William thought carefully before answering. He said he'd learned that the markers of worth he'd been taught to value, formal education, cultural background, social position, were nearly worthless for predicting actual capability or innovation, that the knowledge he'd dismissed as primitive often contained sophisticated understanding developed over generations, that his own success had been far less impressive than he'd believed because it had required so little actual innovation or adaptation. 2 years after their first confrontation at the cattle pens, William and Nalin's partnership had grown into one of the most successful food preservation operations in the Western Territories. They employed over 40 workers, supplied cattle outfits throughout the Great Plains, and were expanding into general consumer markets with preserved foods marketed to frontier families. The business had made Nalin genuinely wealthy and had increased William's fortune, while also transforming his reputation from merely rich to actually respected for something beyond accumulation. But the partnership's significance extended beyond financial success. It had become a model for cross-cultural collaboration that challenged assumptions on multiple sides. Apache communities saw that traditional knowledge could be valuable in the modern economy when properly applied and protected. White business owners recognized that innovation could come from unexpected sources if prejudices didn't blind them to opportunity. The partnership demonstrated practically what abstract calls for cooperation never quite achieved. The relationship between William and Nalin had also deepened into genuine friendship, despite the historical weight that could have made such friendship impossible. They'd learned to navigate the complicated dynamics of their partnership, William's ongoing work to recognize and counteract his ingrained privileges, Nalin's appropriate wariness balanced against willingness to trust when trust was earned. Neither pretended the power imbalances of their broader society disappeared within their partnership, but they worked consciously to prevent those imbalances from determining their specific relationship. One spring afternoon, they toured the expanded facility that now occupied an entire city block in Dodge City. Nalin pointed out improvements she wanted to make: better ventilation systems, expanded storage, space for developing new product lines. William made notes and offered suggestions about financing and construction. It was a comfortable working relationship that had become almost routine. Nalin paused at a window overlooking the production floor and asked William whether he'd ever imagined, during his campaign to drive her out of business, that they'd end up here. William admitted he'd never imagined anything like their current situation. He'd been so certain of his understanding of the world that alternative possibilities hadn't existed in his thinking. He said that certainty now seemed like a kind of blindness that had prevented him from seeing what was actually in front of him. Nalin observed that many people went through entire lives without questioning that kind of certainty, that William's willingness to examine and change his understanding was rarer than he probably recognized. She said she'd known many people damaged by the prejudices of settlers, but few who'd done the difficult work of actually transforming those prejudices. She didn't excuse his initial behavior, but she respected the change he'd managed. William asked Nalin what she'd learned from their partnership. She said it had taught her that change was possible even in people who seemed completely rigid in their prejudices, though only when they chose it themselves and did the difficult internal work. She'd also learned that partnership across deep cultural divides required constant attention and adjustment, that good intentions weren't sufficient without ongoing work to recognize and address power imbalances. Most importantly, she'd learned that her grandmother's teachings had value that extended far beyond what she'd initially imagined. The traditional knowledge she'd grown up with had seemed like remnants of a past that was being destroyed. But applying that knowledge in new contexts had revealed that wisdom adapted rather than merely preserved could be powerful in ways that honored tradition while serving present needs. Her success had allowed her to provide support for other Apache families displaced around Dodge City, creating employment and sharing techniques that connected traditional knowledge with economic survival. That afternoon, they received a telegram from an investor group in Chicago interested in discussing national distribution of their preserved foods. It was an opportunity that could expand their operation dramatically, but would also require decisions about maintaining quality and control while scaling up significantly. William and Nalin looked at each other, recognized the challenge and opportunity equally, and began discussing how to approach the negotiation in ways that protected their values while allowing growth. The story concluded not with perfect resolution. Too many challenges remained in a society still deeply divided by prejudice, but with demonstrated possibility. William had learned that wealth didn't purchase wisdom or worth, that the person he'd tried to destroy had far more to teach him than he'd had to offer her. Nalin had transformed desperate survival into thriving success while honoring her grandmother's legacy. Together, they'd built something that neither could have created alone, proving that collaboration across difference was possible when pride yielded to genuine respect. Their partnership stood as living refutation of the prejudices that had nearly prevented it from existing at all.